Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to my talk. And at first, I would like to introduce to you the topics of my talk. I will talk about perspectives from Quran and Hadith exegesis on the question of the relationship between Islamic theology and science. Second topic is systematic theological approaches. And finally, I would like to show you some examples of recent research on this area. So let's first start with the beginning, when it's about Islam and natural sciences, with the actual discourses on this field. There are, in last years, there have been many publications on this issue, and I've here some examples that were published in the last years and decades. It's from Stefano Bigliardi, Islam and the Quest for Modern Science. It's from Nidal Gassoum, Islam's Quantum Question, and especially on the topic of evolutionary theory, Shoaib Ahmed Malik, Islam and Evolution, Al-Ghazali and the Modern Evolutionary Paradigm. And with a more historical approach, Marwa El-Shakri has a work, Reading Darwin in Arabic. And these are contemporary and important publications for a general overview on this field. But I would like to focus on some central questions at first on exegesis. What's the background? There's some background knowledge that we have to bring here to understand the topic. First of all, the divine revelatory character of the Quran is generally accepted in Islamic theology in the past and today. That's a starting point. Before we discuss anything, it's very important to focus on this aspect, that the Quran is the word of Allah, for the most people who make researches in this area. Second point, the Quranic text has taken on an unprecedented reference function for legitimization discourses in the modern age. Some centuries ago, the Quran wasn't always the central text for discussing philosophical and theological questions, but in the modern ages, the Quran became a very central text for Islamic theology, and philosophical and theological discussions, they were a little bit more put in the background. That's the reason why I begin with exegesis and not with philosophy or theology. And as a result, questions of a systematic theological type are often discussed exegetically. That's something which for non-Muslims sometimes looks a little strange, when Muslims always refer to Quran when it's not about Quran, but about nature, for example, and the Quranic exegesis is a very important point. And I will show you with one example why exegesis is very important and which perspectives today are discussed within this scheme. First of all, I will not talk about Big Bang cosmology or evolutionary theory. I will talk about a very much simpler question about the moving of the sun and the moving of the earth. And I brought here a Quranic verse. In the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, we have the following ayah, قَالِ إِبْرَاهِيمُ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْتِي بِالشَّمْسِ مِنَ الْمَشْرِقِ. This means Abraham said, indeed Allah brings the sun from the east. Yeah, this is a verse from the Quran. And when we're looking at modern science and when we're talking about sunrise or sunset, there are some central theses. Since Copernic, there is very simple and they're very well known for us. The movements of the sun in the sky are the result of our perspective as observers. And these movements of the sun are due to the fact that the earth rotates around itself and around the sun. So that's a problem, since the first here above, it's about sunrise, and that's in the east. And these descriptions are descriptions from a scientific point of view. So the question is there a problem with this Quranic verse and the scientific facts? No, there's no problem. We all say the sun's rising or the sun is setting, for example. We're talking about sunrise and sunset, and no one would say that's a conflict with modern science, because science teaches that Earth rotates, and that's why we see the sun rising, for example. Yeah. So this first alone is not yet a scientific statement at the first glance. But when we're now dealing with exegetical positions on these verses, we find different perspectives. One of them I would call maximalist traditionalism. They say the Quran states clearly that it is the sun that orbits the earth. because Allah brings the sun from the east, so it's the sun which is moving, according to this interpretation. So it is not true that Earth orbits the sun. According to this perspective, Earth is stationary. Earth does not move, and Earth does also not rotate. It's the sun together with the whole cosmos which rotates around the Earth, according to this exegesis. And does this position today have representatives? Yes, it has. And it's especially scholars from the Wahhabi and Salafi spectrum. But not only that, but these are the most famous ones. They have the idea that it's absolutely wrong that Earth rotates. Earth does not rotate. I've got some examples from the internet. You found very, very many texts and lectures from Wahhabi scholars because they have much influence. And this is my favorite quotation here, this one. This is from Ubayd al-Jabari, and he says at the end of a talk on this issue, Earth does not rotate, and then he says, "Al-falakiyuna aktharuhum juhal." This means the most astronomers are ignorant or idiots. Yeah, so that it's not possible that Earth rotates, and these are people with influence. So the maximalist traditionalism, I've called it this way because not every traditionalist is a geocentrist. The most traditionalists accept, of course, that Earth rotates, but we have seen that there are some people who don't accept it because they interpret the Quranic verse from above in this sense that the Earth is fixed and the sun rotates, and whoever claims the opposite, that's kufr, unbelief, they say. So what are solutions from an exegetical point of view? A very important voice is the voice of a metaphorical exegesis. That's a method, ta'wil. That's a metaphorical of figurative interpretation. And what do these people say? They say, bringing from the East is a figurative description of our daily observation which is attributed to God. It's not a description of absolute movement in absolute space, for example. Yeah. So you have so when there is a contradiction between the literal meaning of a Quranic verse or a hadith and modern science or scientific proofs, then you have to read the Quran metaphorically, and this leads to some independence between between Quran exegesis and modern science. Independence means it's not necessary always to look into the Quran to check if it's true what the scientists actually claim or do not claim. And this is a very influential perspective, the metaphorical exegesis, because it was made very famous by Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, an Islamic scholar from the 11th century. And he's the one who made this idea of ta'wil, of figurative Quranic interpretation. He made it very well known. But also, for example, Ibn Rushd, alias Averroes, is also known for metaphorical exegesis. But let's look at another approach. But there are also other approaches. This one I would call text analytical approach. They say, the details given in the Quran do not clearly support or refute the idea of an absolutely motionless earth. So only by reading the Quran, you have nor a proof for geocentrism, neither a proof against geocentrism. This is a text analytical approach, and this also leads to independence. When you say the information in the Quran, there are so few, you cannot bring them into conflict with science. That's a text analytical approach. And a further approach, which also leads to independence, is something which we would call here in the academic context historical critical approach, or historical hermeneutics. What do the defenders of this position claim? They say, the Quran uses indeed geocentric formulations, but only for pedagogical reasons, in order to more easily convey its ethical and theological message to its first addressees. And the first addressees, it's not us, it's the people who lived in the time of the Prophet Muhammad many centuries ago. These are the first addressees, so the Quran uses their geocentric way of speaking about the universe, because the Quran does not deal with physics or natural science, it deals with the impressions of mankind and about the sensual perception and things like that. This leads also to independence. So what we can now see is that there are many ways of making the conflict between revelation and science to solve these conflicts. The historical critical approach is not the only approach. There are many other approaches, because these approaches, which I showed you up there are classical approaches from historical Islamic tradition. The historical hermeneutics approach is rather a modern, a new approach, which is in Islamic theology, not the majority view. So I think it's helpful to see that there are different ways of making scripture and modern science not conflict with each other. So we have the conflict perspective, we have independence perspectives between science and Quranic exegesis, but there are also some integrational perspectives. And the well-known one is the scientific exegesis as a tafsir ilmi. And the defenders of this view, they claim exactly the opposite from the first view. They say the Quran stated 14 centuries before the rotation of the earth. And they cite here, for example, the following passage of the Quran. You see the mountains which you suppose to be stationary, while they drift like passing clouds. And the ones who interpret the Quran in this sense, they read this Quranic verse as a proof of movement of earth. So we have here exactly the opposite from the conflict perspective by using nearly the same method, taking a Quranic verse literal by adding some interpretation, that you can have a very heavy conflict or a very nice integrational perspectives. These perspectives, which I here summarize as conflict, independence, and integration, these terms they come from Jan Barber, a Christian scientist and philosopher who made a four-kind typology. I've omitted here the dialogue perspective because of lack of time and place. But in the Islamic discourse, all these perspectives are important. Yeah? And the most popular ones are the first one and the last one. These are the most popular ones. So the conflict perspective and the scientific exegesis perspective, they are very influential, and especially on the issue of evolutionary theory. In the more academic discourses, we find rather a tendency to the independence perspectives that I highlighted here. But these perspectives, of course, there's a discussion on these independence views. Let me give some examples. On the metaphorical exegesis, you can, of course, interpret a text always metaphorical if you want to. But tafsir, the knowledge, the science of exegesis in Islam says you have to. There must be a reason for reading a passage metaphorical. You cannot read anything metaphorically just because you like it. There must be a sufficient reason for switching from the literal meaning to a figurative meaning. So, at what degree of scientific certainty may figurative interpretation be applied? Is, for example, evolutionary theory proven enough to reinterpret the Quran in a metaphorical sense, or has one to admit that the evolutionary theory is not yet proven enough, for example, because these positions are discussed in the Islamic world today. And some find evolutionary theory is proven enough to take the Quran metaphorically, and others say no, you have never seen that man evolved from simple beings because no one saw this directly, so this is no proof. But of course, this is not a very strong argument. But this discussion is very active in the Islamic world. On the text analytical approach, there's also a controversial question: is scanning the surface of the Quranic text sufficient as an exegetical method? And most Quran scholars would say, no, that's not enough. It's not enough only to read the surface of the text. But the text analytical approach, for them, it's enough when the surface of the text does not contradict, for example, evolution, then there's no contradiction between them. Another controversial question concerning the historical approach, historical hermeneutical approach, is the following. Is it conceivable that language does not convey any descriptive or empirical content at all? The representatives of the historical approach, they claim that texts like Quran have only ethical and theological intentions. They have no empirical intentions. They claim not to describe an empirical world. They only describe a pure character, for example. And this from the perspective of the philosophy of language, one has to ask, is it really possible that a text or a myth only transports some ethical message and not also some kind of empirical claims which can be criticized? So I just want to show some of the discussions which are actually in the Islamic world very important. Actually there's no need now to discuss all here to the end. Okay, that was the exegetical approach. Now let's switch to the systematic theological approaches. These go much deeper than the perspectives that I showed you just before. So what's the background of this discussion? First of all, the main influences on these discussions is the state of modern natural science and the Christian-influenced religion and science discourse. It's very important that most discussions, actually from the recent Islamic world, they have a parallel in Christian discourse. some decades before or 1 century before, but the discussions are very similar. There are many parallels between them. And Muslims are very interested in what Christian philosophers and theologians write about these things. Yeah? Second, this is also valid for the ones who deny evolution, for example. So many Muslims use the arguments from Christian evangelicals who wrote many books against evolutionary theory, and sometimes Muslims they use the contents nearly verbatim. So the second point is who are the main players on this field? These are often, it's very interesting, natural scientists. Especially physicists are very active in this field. It's often natural scientists with a sound knowledge of Islamic theology and philosophy. It's very comparable to the Christian discourse on science and religion, which was where Jan Barber was an important founder, but many Christian writers on this issue, in the Christian context, are also physicists. John Polkinghorne, for example, Jan Barber, Arthur Peacock is a physicist, and many others. So physicists, they say, now we are talking about theology. The theologians, please step a little aside now. The physicists come and we explain you how to interpret Quran and the nature truly. And this is very important. There is a very frequent recourse to metaphysical and epistemological models from the intellectual Islamic tradition. That's often very surprising for Christian dialogue partners. Muslims begin with Ghazali. Ghazali died 900 years ago. Yeah? Or they begin with Ibn Rushd or Avicenna. They died 800 or over 1,000 years ago. And then Muslims say, let's develop an Islamic perspective. And then first we read some people who are dead since 1,000 years. Yeah? But one has to admit that these authors, they don't take the philosophy of Ibn Rushd or the theology of Ghazali by word into the present. They translate it in a new context. They change it. So Islamic philosophy is changed by these Muslim physicists. They take ideas, for example, from the Islamic rational theology, from the Kalam, from 1,200 years ago in Baghdad and Basra. And then they change the theology so much that it fits on the conditions of today, because they say that the main ideas, they still are valid, but the shape has to change, the context has changed. And so they try, it's like Neo-Aristotelianism, for example. The philosophy of Aristotle is outdated, but when you update it, then you can, of course, employ a Neo-Aristotelianism, for example. So every philosopher of the antique times, they have followers today, but not word by word, but by new interpreting. And this is exactly the same. So let me give some examples. First of all, let's start with a conflict perspective in the systematic theological area. I would call this essentialism. What do essentialists claim? They say modern science is part of a worldview based on chance and materialism, and thus has to be replaced by an Islamic science. So forget about modern physics, let's take Islamic physics. Forget about modern chemistry, let's do some Islamic chemistry. And the essentialists, they are afraid that the materialistic influence in Western thinking, that it makes modern science not metaphysically neutral enough. For example, Sayyid Hossein Nasr, a Muslim philosopher and Sufi, is a very important voice who has this perspective. Modern science is nothing but what Islam needs to integrate or to adapt. We have to reinvent science new. So that's a conflict perspective, and these are very intellectual persons. These are not persons who only know Quran and Hadith exegesis. These people are experts on philosophy and Sufism, but they have a conflict-based perspective. So let's look at the integration perspectives. A very simple one comes from history of science. These representatives say, for example, Islamic scientists discussed the ideas of a rotating Earth and of an evolution of man centuries ago. So these ideas are nothing new to Islam. One could call this perspective, this is an integration which took place long ago. It happened many centuries ago. There is nothing to integrate because Islam knows these ideas that I'm talking about. But this is a quite superficial perspective. This is superficial. There are texts from Ibn Khaldun or a quotation from Al-Biruni, for example, and that's not enough for an integration perspective. But it's a beginning. So let's look at the real integration perspectives from nowadays. One example comes from Islamic philosophy, an updated version of Islamic philosophy. They claim the following: the laws of nature, or the secondary causes, they are God-given, and thus never broken in the physical world by Allah. Allah created a world of nature, and this nature has causal efficacy. That means that there are really cause and effect relationships in nature. And this goes back to Ibn Sina, but especially to Ibn Rushd. Especially to Ibn Rushd, because in Ibn Rushd's late philosophy, the Averroes, the Andalusian philosopher from the 12th century, in his philosophy, the causality in nature is not broken by Allah. There's also no active intellect which interrupts the natural processes. The nature has a potentiality to bring to put the potential forms into actuality. But all the forms are given by God through the intellect of God, and nature is a causal effect of the mind of God. And who is representative? For example, Nidal Gesum nowadays. Nidal Gesum, an Algerian astrophysicist who begins his book Islam's Quantum Question with a biography of Averroes, Ibn Rushd. So Ibn Rushd is still alive, is still influential, but in a newly interpreted form. Nidal Gesum would never claim the geocentrism of Averroes to be true. Nidal Gesum says that Ibn Rushd made many errors due to his Aristotelian worldview. That's normal. There's no problem, he says. We have to look at the core worldview of Ibn Rushd, and the core view is the one I have summarized here, according to Nidal Gesum. So Falsafa is an important inspiration nowadays, but much more the Kalam. What's Kalam? Kalam is the rationalist theology of Islam, which began in the 8th, 9th, especially 9th and 10th century in Baghdad and Basra, did some kind of Islamic philosophy without citing Aristotle, Platon, and the others. This is only this is logical reasoning, but not with pre-Socratic philosophers or something like this. They only use the Quran, Hadith, and logics, but they employ philosophical methods. They are influenced by philosophy. And this is a very, very interesting kind of worldview that the Kalam developed. And the recent versions, the new version of Kalam, reads like the following: Allah recreates all properties of the atoms in every moment anew. The Kalam says everything consists of atoms. We too, everything, the sky, the earth, everything consists of the same atoms, point-like particles. And Allah creates in every moment all properties of these atoms anew. These properties include also the position space. So even the position of the atoms are created in every moment anew by God. Some compare to a cartoon, to a Trickfilm, would the Germans say. Yeah? So you have a screen with 25 frames per second, which is always renewed, and we have an impression as if there's a causality in nature, but there's no causality in nature. There's only frames which are bound together by the creating mind, and not by nature itself. And the nature of laws are not in nature. The nature of laws, these are regularities who are used by God to create these atoms. So God can create an atom however he wants. He can create miracles whenever he wants, but he doesn't. He restricts himself to recreating the atoms according to some regularities, and that's what we call laws of nature. I will later give an example for this view. So this leads also to an integration perspective. And this is more influential than Falsafa in Islamic world, because Kalam, the Ash'arite Kalam especially, has much more people in the Islamic world who take it seriously. Falsafa is not taken by many. It's more academics who take Falsafa seriously, but Kalam reaches more people. That's an advantage of the Kalam approach. But these people, they accept evolutionary theory, they accept Big Bang cosmology, they accept neurobiology, because they say, hey, it's all atoms. The atoms are controlled by God. So if there's an evolutionary process, then even the mutations in cells are done according to the will of God. So it's a theistic evolution, what results here from this perspective. Theistic evolution, and not the evolution by chance where God throws the dishes and looks what comes out. But there's also a third intellectual center of these discussions, and it's Sufism. I would call it theoretical Sufism, especially Ibn al-Arabi, the famous Andalusian Sufi, is often quoted here. And what does this perspective today, what new perspective do physicists with this view claim? They say, the cosmos is a place of infinite self-disclosure of God, by the manifestations of his names in form of permanently evolving creation and in form of the mathematical structure of the laws. So, the universe, God created the universe as a place of infinite self-disclosure, and it's His name, it's His attributes, it's His knowledge which is manifest in the cosmos, and this includes also the mathematical structure of the laws, which are a manifestation of the oneness and beauty of God. And this also leads to an integrative perspective. So I have to finish now in 2 minutes. So let's look at what I would like to show you. This is a quotation from a Sufi physicist. And he, for example, claims that even the idea of a multiverse, even in chaotic inflation, this chaotic inflation does not sound like theistic creation. But in this framework, chaotic inflation, it means that in the primordial quantum vacuum, there bubble out universes permanently. So there are many parallel universes which are always bubbling out of the false vacuum of the quantum vacuum from the beginning of the cosmos. And he says now that's a problem. That this quantum fluctuations are manifestations of the names of God. This is a perspective here from the Sufi, and this leads to the result that it's good that there are so many universes, because Ibn Arabi says la taqrar fi tajalli. There's no repetition in the self-disclosure of God. So this cosmology is here bound together with Ibn Arabi's worldview. That's Bruno Abdelhak Guiderdoni. He's the one from this. The quotation is from him. And as I said, there are also, in context, evolution is no problem for these authors, but not a random evolution, but a theistic evolution, where every mutational step is given by God. Okay, this is the one, the representative from the Kalam with the atoms. This Basil Attai, he's very well known for this, for his approach. He's the one who employs the atomism of the Kalam, and he says we can reinterpret the whole quantum theory of modern times in terms of Kalam theology from Baghdad and Basra 1,200 years ago, because also in quantum theology there's something like atomism. It's called elementary particles, and the elementary particles, they fluctuate and they behave very strange. They behave a little bit like the atoms from the Islamic theologians in Baghdad and Basra. They behave chaotic. They don't behave deterministically. They behave indeterministically. And so Basil Attai and people like him say, oh, that's nice. There's a parallel between them. So let's investigate if one can interpret quantum field theory or quantum theory in terms of Kalam theology. And so they change Kalam theology. They actualize it, but some of the ideas of Kalam still remain valid. And it's a very active area of research at the moment. So unfortunately, the time is over, so I cannot show you the parallels between quantum field theory and Kalam atomism, but maybe if you want, you can look later at the slides here. These are some of the people who are active on this field, and with this, I would like to conclude. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry that I had to interrupt you, but maybe you can answer questions related to these things now. So the floor is open. I see one hand raising, another one, the second one. Okay, let's start with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Turan. Excellent paper, very clear. I have a question. When this question of the sun rotating or the earth rotating become a theological problem proper in the Islamic world? Because in the Christian world it's interesting. So it's during all the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, late antiquity, this was not a theological problem, it was rather a scientific problem. The true authority was Aristotle, De Pseudo et Mundo. And there were always alternatives available. So you had heliocentric proposals in antiquity. You had semi-geocentric proposals like Martianus Capella or so. And Thomas Aquinas said, it's just a hypothesis. So the standard model is just a hypothesis. And it became a theological problem only after Galileo. And then they began to excavate where is something to be found in the Bible which says that the the earth, the sun is moving, and they found something in the book of Joshua. And only then it became a problem. How was it in the Islamic world?
Thank you for this very important question. After Copernicus and Galilei, it lasted some 1 or 2 centuries until this discussion reached the Islamic world. So the Islamic scholars, most of them, they learned about the known cosmology very lately. And when they learned about them, they learned at the same time that there's some materialism in Europe developing, and there are atheist philosophers and something like this. And this led to some prejudices, Vorteile. This led by at some Islamic scholars to a problem with this cosmology. But this one is not the majority. There are many Islamic scholars who accepted the new Copernican model. They accepted heliocentrism, for example. And nowadays, many Islamic scholars accept, for example, modern cosmology. So but there's a number of scholars which were never open for these ideas, because they said the following. They said, in the first centuries of Islam, all Islamic scholars claimed the earth to be motionless. And so we cannot reinterpret the Quran, because our elder scholars from the first centuries, they know better than us, than we can know. So science must be wrong, because in the first centuries of Islam, in the tafsir, in the exegesis, there was no position like heliocentrism. But in the empirical Islamic sciences, there are, of course, astronomers who also had these alternative ideas. For example, Al-Biruni is quoted sometimes as a Muslim physicist from the 11th century, for example, and he cites other Muslim astronomers who were talking about the rotation of the Earth. So this model was known, and this was no contradiction to faith. I think it's especially the very scripturally thinking scholars, especially from Salafi, Hanbalite, and Wahhabi contexts. It's a defined group which only accept a Quranic interpretation which is based on sound tradition from the first centuries. So you cannot sit there and interpret the Quran. You have to look how Ibn Kathir interpreted the Quran, how Ibn Taymiyyah interpreted the Quran, and these also were people who were no scientists and who lived long before Copernicus and Galilei. So there was a theological problem. The theological problem is created by some scholars. I think that's an important point. And one important point, I would like to quote Ghazali, a Muslim scholar from the 11th century, Ghazali. And Ghazali saw these conflicts, and they saw that the literalist scholars of Islam are a problem for science. Ghazali, as a theologian, said, "You theologians, you don't have any idea of science, so please don't debate with astronomers, because the astronomers, they have proofs for their claims. So, and then you find a Quranic text which seems to contradict your interpretation. Then your interpretation has to be done metaphorically or figurative." That was Ghazali, and Ghazali is a theologian, because Ghazali saw the problem that in his time, in the 11th century, there were many texts, like the scholars I showed at the beginning. There were Islamic scholars who only knew the text, the classical interpretation of them, and who rejected science, who rejected philosophy, in these times philosophy and astronomy. And Ghazali saw this danger, and he said, Ghazali says, after it is proven that the earth is created, it's completely unimportant if the earth is flat or a globe or has 6 corners or 8. Theologically, that's no problem for us, did Ghazali say. And so this is so the theological problem arises later, after Galilei, as some scholars saw the risk of materialism, and they didn't want to give up the interpretations from the first centuries of Islam. And Ghazali is, in this point of view, a much more progressive perspective.
Thank you very much. I find it extremely helpful to apply Iron Barber's models on these problems. But I was wondering, you had independence, conflict, integration. Iron Barber has this 4th model, dialogue. And it was also for me always hard in teaching to explain to students what the distinction between integration and dialogue is. So do you have any examples where for the relation where it's this 4th category of Barber?
Yes.
And then like my second question regarding independence, good that you brought back the slide. When I read that, I thought there are different stages or levels of independence. Like the metaphorical exegesis is an independence that can very easily lead to conflict, because a lot of theories of revelation would say, no, you cannot just read it metaphorical, while the historical hermeneutics is more integrative. So is it a coincidence that you listed it in this direction? Because I think it fits really well, and you have 3 different modes of independence here.
Yes. Thanks. These are 2 very important questions. I've thought very long about the true order, from the perfect order, how to arrange this. Let me begin with the first question. In the Islamic tradition, especially with Ghazali, you can only apply a metaphorical exegesis if there's a rational proof in the outer world, for example, about the moving of the earth or about the shape of the earth, for example. And that was Ghazali's point. Ghazali said, when the astronomers or the scientists have a proof for something, then it's necessary for us to interpret a text metaphorically. But of course, not everyone is convinced by this, because some say, no, it's not proven enough, the rational sciences are not proven enough. So, of course, there's discussion. The problem with historical hermeneutics is manifold from Islamic perspective. The main problem is there's no clear boundary for interpretation. So it has speculative elements, and a text-bound religion like Islam has it's easier for Islamic theology and for exegesis to remain in the classical approaches. And metaphorical exegesis is a classical approach. And so the historical hermeneutics is contra-intuitive for many Muslims, for example. There are a few examples in Islamic history who interpreted the Quran completely as an allegory. That's also true, but it's not the majority. And so I think that the historical critical approach is very new in Islamic context, and it's not established, and there's a debate because it doesn't have many representatives, but the other approaches have many representatives. So this would be a first answer. I know that's not completely answering all which is related here with this. The second question was about dialogue, a very important category in Jan Barber's four-fold systematics. There are many examples, but these are not so controversial. There is no ideological debate on them. That's why I did not take it here, because the primary debate in the Islamic world was, firstly, in modern times, was modern science contradicts Islam. So modern science is true or Islam is true, but both cannot be true. In this atmosphere, evolutionary theory came to the Islamic world, and so it was always a debate about conflict or integration, or, for example, there are no separation approaches, for example. I've called this independence, but the independence is on the exegetical level, not on the metaphysical level, which I pointed out here. And so, but let me give some examples for dialogue. For example, again, Ghazali, in his biography, Munqidh min al-Dalal, he said that there are 6 philosophical sciences, and one science is problematic, the metaphysics, because the metaphysics of the Islamic philosophers, of Avicenna, Al-Farabi, and others, they contain elements which contradict his interpretation of the Quran. So metaphysics cannot be accepted, but the other sciences can be accepted. And one of the most important philosophical sciences that Muslims adopted was logics. The organon of Aristotle, the first and second analytics, and some other writings, they also influenced the Muslim discourse. And Islamic theology adopted the logics of antiquity, especially in form of Aristotle, and they integrated it. And it did not last long, but after Ghazali claimed that logics is necessary for theology. And Ghazali said, you can never believe a theologian who does not know logics. So if you don't know logics, don't talk about theology. First learn logics, and then come here. And then one could say about logics is not Islamic. Ghazali said the laws of logics, which Aristotle wrote down, they are originally the teachings from the prophets. That was a trick by Ghazali. Ghazali said the origin of logics is not the philosophers. The philosophers look what the prophets have written, and then they said, let's do some philosophy with this. Yeah, but the origin are prophets. and Islamic Sufis. That was Ghazali's claim. He tried to make logics more acceptable for Islamic theologians, so he had to say, this is not from Aristotle, this is from our people, from the prophets and so on. But it was philosophical logics which Ghazali adopted, and he said, in this point we have no conflict with the philosophers. That's an example for dialogue, and this philosophy and this logical thinking in the next centuries, it was very influential. And there were some Islamic theologians from the Wahhabi Salafi spectrum, we would today say, the Wahhabi is new, but the Salafi spectrum, there were also some scholars who accused Ghazali for implementing the philosophy of antiquity into Islamic theology. And Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, says Ghazali is lost in the middle of philosophy, and he brought the philosophy into our theology. That's important because it shows that the dialogue between Islamic theology and rational sciences, it was very active. And I'll just give one example. You can find in every century these examples of adopting methods. And at the other side, for example, Islamic astronomy, for example, they took many notions and words from the Quran. When describing the universe, they used many concepts and notions from the Quran and integrated this into a more empirical world. These are some few examples that I'm just that came to my mind.